Currently, Dr. Heerey is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and does research on social things.
Yeah.
So, welcome. Thank you for coming today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, so I do research on social things, and I'm going to tell you about those, mostly about those social things, and not about so many clinical things to get to the very end. So, social interactions are the stuff that life is made out of, right? They start from the moment that you're born, and the interactions that you have with your family, with your caregivers from the beginning are the ones that shape your development all the way through. They shape how you interact with peers, which then shapes what you learn in school, which shapes the kinds of jobs you can get, it shapes your relationships with your colleagues, and who you end up marrying if you choose to do that, right? So social interactions are something that's incredibly important across the life's course. Now, the problem with social interactions is that we don't really know that much about them. They're amazing. They make us love and laugh and cry and hate and everything in between. So how do we make sense of this massive cacophony of social signals that we get every single day? And that is the tricky bit. Now, no two interactions are the same, but I'll bet that if I went to coffee with any one of you, we could have a perfectly pleasant interaction. We could find something to chat about. It would be really interesting. And that tells us that there's regularity in this sort of mass of signals that we receive. And my lab studies what that regularity is and how we do it. So social interactions and the study of those interactions is extremely challenging. And it's challenging for three big reasons. The first one is that social behavior is extremely variable. From one interaction to the next, there's no guarantee that the same cue is even going to repeat itself with a few exceptions. It's also really difficult to interpret social cues outside of their natural context. So when you give me a smile, what does that mean? Does that smile mean the same thing if I get it from you versus if I get it from someone I don't like very much, or someone who I know doesn't like me? So it's really difficult to interpret cues outside of their natural context. And the third reason that it's really difficult to study is if we want to make any sort of causal conclusions about what causes what else in an interaction, we need to manipulate that interaction, right?
Terrified you're going to fall. So, now I don't have to worry anymore.
So we need to manipulate that interaction, and that is something that's almost impossible to do in any kind of a clean way that doesn't break the relationships between how people understand and make sense of the cues that they see. So this is the problem with studying social interactions, and it's a really difficult one. Now, to overcome these challenges, my lab takes what we call neuroeconomic view of social interactions, which means we look at social cues just a little bit differently than the average psychological view. So we examine cues in terms of how good they are, their quality, the degree to which they're subjectively desirable. Are they coffee crisp? Are they Oreo? Or are they, what are they called? Creme. All right. There was a very important conversation happening before somebody arrived. So we examine these things in terms of their subjective desirability. And we like this model because it allows us to measure with relative precision the degree to which people like a particular cue, how they evaluate that cue. And the other thing that it allows us to do is it allows us to avoid the problem of having to kind of reverse engineer an explanation post hoc for why somebody did a particular cue and what that cue means. So we get a pass on that reverse engineering problem, which is a big problem in the literature, because if we assume that a particular cue means one thing, we're going to be wrong quite a lot of the time. So this talk is going to sort of touch on 4 areas. The first area that I'm going to talk to you about is how we evaluate cues. So we're going to look at subjective desirability for a particular cue, and that cue is smiles. We're going to look at how smiles are used, how people use them in interactions, and how that reinforcement value shapes how we use them. Yeah.
Any requests for remote listeners to talk a little closer to the mic? Can you put that?
Well, yes, I can stand up here.
That's really sensitive.
Yeah.
Is this better? Can you find out?
Yeah, that's right.
switch to max volume now.
All right. Thank you. Yep. So we're going to look at social reciprocity. We're also going to ask the question, what happens if we choose the value of these cues? If we manipulate their value, how does that affect, by changing somebody's social state, how does that affect how they use and evaluate those cues? And then we're going to finish up in the clinical world with a couple of clinical populations, or semi-clinical populations in one case. So let's start with this cue, smiles. We know what a smile is. I've seen almost all of you give one at some point already today. We're going to take a really broad brushstrokes view of this. So a lot of the interactions that we study are general getting to know you interactions. And so there are two kinds of smiles that appear relatively regularly in those interactions. These are genuine smiles, and genuine smiles engage the orbicularis oculi, which is the muscle that raises the eye, as well as the zygomaticus muscle, which is the cheek raiser. This is the one that's responsible for your cheeks going up when you smile. This is an example of the genuine smile. Here's an example of the polite smile. And you can see the change on these two women's faces as they change their smiles. So these are the two general smiles that we're going to look at. And this is a very, as I said, very broad classification. There are many nuances to this particular type of cue. But the nice thing about smiles, and the reason we pick them, is that as a target behavior, is that we see them almost all the time. In just about every interaction we're in, there's smile exchanges. So they're one of these cues that happens to be a bit more common and frequent, and because they're more common and frequent, that makes them easier to study. So the first thing I'm going to suggest to you is that smiles are a form of social reward, that we use these cues as if they're social rewards, and we respond to them as if they're social rewards, and therefore they have a value that's going to be measurable. And in fact, we've gone the route of measuring that value in monetary terms. So let me show you how we do that. So we have a task, and it's a funny little learning task that has two phases. At the beginning of the task, it looks like this, and what you're told is you're going to see a face in a neutral pose in the center of the screen, and your job on each trial is to pick the same side of that coin, heads or tails, that the face has chosen. And if you pick that same side, what will happen is the face will smile at you. If you don't, the face will frown at you. So that's what happens in this game. Now, every time you hear a smile, you win 2 cents. And this adds up over time. So that's what participants are doing. Now, what we don't, that's what they think they're doing. I can also tell you a bunch of these days have used undergraduate student participants. Undergraduates really like money, so we do pay them at the end of this. They love money, so we do pay them at the end. They can go buy coffee, right? You might buy them something from Starbucks the next day. So they tell us they're playing for money. We tell them to play for money, and that's going to be important in a minute. What we don't tell them about this task is that whether they choose heads or tails does not matter at all. And in fact, what we really manipulate in this task is the win probability. So we have high value faces that give you rewards on 80% of trials, and low value faces that give you rewards on 70% of trials. And then we are also manipulating the smile type that participants see. So they either see genuine smiles or polite smiles in the context of this task. And so what we do is we show them each one of these faces. They play each one of these faces a whole bunch of times in random order. And we don't care about their behavior here. And then we switch to what we call the test phase of our task. And the test phase of our task looks just like the first part, but instead we ask them, who do they want to play on that round? So they're making a decision between whether they want to play this face or this face. Now, I told you undergraduates like money, and that's how they tell us they're playing. If you're playing for money, this is the face you're going to pick. This is the 80%, a high value face, polite smiler. But if you care about those social rewards and if they have value to you, you might just pick this low value face that genuinely smiles. So what do participants do? how do they apportion their decisions? And so we showed them all the possible pairings of the faces a whole bunch of times over the course of the test phase. And we asked, how do they choose? So we have high value faces, which are worth 1.6 pence. This was done in Britain, so it's in Great British pounds or pence, pence per trial. And the low value, the low value faces are worth 1.4 pence per trial. It's very close. So the first thing we want to ask is, what can participants tell the difference between this? And the answer is they can, sort of. So when they're choosing between a high value genuinely smiling face and a low value genuinely smiling face, they're picking the genuinely smiling face more often than chance. This white line in the middle is chance. Same thing when the smile is polite. So now what happens? Now comes the interesting condition. So if we ask you to choose between a high value genuinely smiling face and a low value politely smiling face, well, what you can see is that there's a big advantage. People like that genuine smile that much more. It's become that much more valuable to us. And it turns out that when the genuine smile, when they're choosing between the situation I just saw, they actually have a preference for this low value face when it's genuinely smiling. And that tells us something about how they prefer those smiles in a way that's a little bit cleaner than saying, well, do you like this one better or that one better? Because that depends on the face it comes from. So how we get that value is and I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to orient you to this graph because we're going to see this graph a couple more times in the context of this presentation. So we crunch these decisions through a model that it's through a statistical model. It's based on multiple regression for those of you who are statisticians. And what's here doesn't really matter. The important thing is how much people value the bars, the height of the bars here is what matters. So the farther the bar is from the white line in the middle, from 0, is the degree to which that cue influences your choice when you're choosing between pairs of faces. So do you prefer high value to low value? Do you have a preference for money or not money? Do you have a preference for genuine smiles or polite smiles? So what you can see is people have a preference for money. They have a preference for seeing genuine relative to polite smiles. If that bar had been negative, then we would be looking at polite smiles. And in fact, there's no interaction between these pieces of data. They add. So basically, what people are doing with these two different rewards is they're summing them together in a linear fashion. Now we can use this to understand how people make decisions in real face-to-face interactions with smiles. So it looks like smiles have a reward value, that they carry that value intrinsically. It's probably learned over the course of sort of the whole social learning history, and that's where I'm going to put my money. I'm not sure that it's innate, although it's become intrinsic after a while. And that integrated percept of the social and monetary value is what people are using to decide on this task, even though they tell us, oh, it's all about the money. So we're then going to ask, well, how about reciprocity, which is another really interesting social signal. And it's a social signal that happens in face-to-face interactions. I do something, you do something back, and that's a social exchange. And we're interested in those social exchanges because that's the place where things seem to break down when you have clinical populations. It's that reciprocity. So we're wondering about the degree to which reciprocity for smiles is a cue in face-to-face interactions. So what do I mean when I say smile reciprocity? So first, let me tell you how we get data for face-to-face interactions. What we usually do is we bring two people who don't know one another, and sometimes people who do, but into a room. We have them sit in 2 chairs, we turn on some video cameras, and we say, you can talk about anything you like. I'll come back after 5 minutes and tell you when it's time to stop. And then we leave, we close the door. And they do whatever they're gonna do. And sometimes it's nothing. There's some giggling and pointing at the video cameras. They do all kinds of things. And then after a few minutes, or after actually it's usually about 30 seconds, they settle down and they start to chat with one another, and they get to know one another, and they find out, do they have something in common, and they have just a standard chat. And so what we would do is we record their behavior on the video cameras, and then we have somebody or something code it. There's some really nice computer automated coding now that essentially takes the timeline of the interaction and says, okay, a smile happened starting at this time and this frame, and here's how long it lasted, and it was a genuine smile. And it does that for each participant. And then we take the timestamps on participant A and participant B on the tapes, we line them up, and that allows us to look at how people exchange these cues in real time. So this is an example of a reciprocated genuine smile where the first person's genuine smile starts, and then the second person's genuine smile follows it. And here's an example of a reciprocated polite smile. Now, do people do this?
Do we smile at each other?
Yeah, do we match on smile type?
Depends how much you like the other person.
Well, our data show that they do, even when they don't necessarily love the other person. So these are data graphing response smiles. So this is what you do when you see your partner do a genuine smile. So when you see your partner do a genuine smile, you're also returning a genuine smile. When you see your partner do a polite smile, you're returning a polite smile. We return somewhere between 70 and 80% of smiles, but we almost always get it right. It's rarely the case that you see the wrong smile.
Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm just curious if you looked at other facial expressions. So in other words, are they just mirroring what they see, or is it specific to smiles?
This is specific to smiles. So yes, you're right to think about mimicry, because there's a whole literature on mimicry. It's not that we never see it. We don't see enough of it. That it's not statistically analyzable because there isn't enough of it. And one of the reasons, this is one of the devil is in the details here. So most of the studies of mimicry have been manipulated, where we say, you're a Confederate. So here's what you're gonna do in this interaction. Every time you see that person smile, you're gonna smile back. And now what happens? Now you're not having a normal interaction anymore. Now all of a sudden, the person who's supposed to be doing this mimicry is going, oh, they smile, I better do it now. And then they're breaking the contingencies, the natural contingencies that happen in interactions, I think. So it's not that it never happens, but the statistical regularity is so small that we don't analyze it.
It happens in this time frame?
It happens
So
in this
because
time frame.
the person on the bottom, that's what, 2/100th of a second later.
I'm going to show you some data on that. Hold your thought.
Yep.
So we're coming to that. Okay, so they do this. Now, what happens when they don't? So we did a project a bunch of years ago, a very long time ago now, looking at a group of people who might not do this in quite the right way. And that group of people is people who report high levels of social anxiety. So what we did in that study is we brought participants in, we had pre-measured them, pre-screened them for social anxiety, and we took people who were non-anxious and randomly paired them with a socially anxious partner or a non-anxious partner. And it turns out that when you randomly pair a person without social anxiety with a socially anxious partner, this is what the socially anxious partners do. So when their partner makes a genuine smile, they still smile back. In fact, they smile back for genuine and polite smiles about the same amount. So in fact, actually even a little bit more. It's closer to 90%. They return almost all of their partner smiles. But what they don't do is they don't match on smile type. That appears to be broken. And there are all kinds of reasons for it. Maybe they have difficulty recognizing those expressions. Maybe they're so nervous they're not feeling the love. I don't know. But there are lots of reasons why they might not. But interestingly, this matters for social outcomes. So when we look at the proportion of genuine smiles that socially anxious participants reciprocate, it turns out to predict how much positive experience, how rewarding their partners feel like this interaction was. So there's something going on there in that reciprocity. So we think this is an important social cue. And now we're going to ask the question, how does that relate to reward value? And now we're coming into the timing piece. So how fast do people reciprocate smiles in real face-to-face interaction? Here's what polite smiles look like. There's a really nice, sort of pretty standard RT distribution looking here, where we see, and this is measured from the moment the first frame of the partner's smile occurs to, and the smile onset is then coded as the first, so from the first frame that your partner starts smiling to the first frame that you start your smile, your response smiles. These are all responded smiles and all smiles that have been responded to with the same smile. So
That'd be defined as like the first upturn of the lips or something.
Yep, the very first frame where that's codifiable, where it's visibly apparent. So here's the distribution of polite smiles. Here's the distribution of genuine smiles, and there's a big difference. So especially at the very early part of the interaction. Now we know that genuine smiles are worth more money than polite smiles. We know they're more valuable. So that gave us, the difference between, and this is a pretty statistically significant difference, the difference between how people return genuine and polite smiles made us think actually maybe there's something going on with the reward value. But of course these are taken from real face-to-face interactions, and anything could be going on, right? We like to, for instance, anticipate the punchline of a joke. And when you're telling somebody something, when you talk about amusing anecdotes, we like to smile. We smile in advance, and there's a lot of other things beside the smile value that might be going on. So one of the questions we want to ask is, so what happens to smiles? Do you see what happens to the time course of these smiles if we really can constrain it to this reward idea? So to do that, we bring this into the lab and we manipulate in the lab. We're now outside the domain of social interaction, and we use a silly little learning task where people see faces that smile at them in one way or another. And of course, again, we're using genuine and polite smiles in our learning task. And what the learning task looks like is this. So it starts out with a fixation cross on the screen, and then you see a face come up. And your job is simply to use trial and error learning to guess whether that face goes with a left-handed button press or a right-handed button press. So you're pressing a key with your left hand versus a key with your right hand on the computer. And as soon as you press a key, a green frame comes up around the face that tells you your response has been registered. And then we let you sit there for a really long time. 4 seconds is a really long time. Now we use 4 seconds because we are recording some extra data here. And then what happens is you get some feedback. So if you were correct, if you got the correct button press, the face smiles at you. Otherwise, he frowns at you, or she, depending on what condition you've been assigned to. So we let participants learn this contingency. And then we ask the question, so there's evidence in the literature suggesting that people automatically mirror the expressions that the people they're interacting with mirror. And that's even true for pictures of faces on computer screens. Go figure. They're not big, the displays aren't big, they're small. And so what we do is we actually measure with EMG. So we put electrodes on people's faces. We recorded from the orbicularis oculi here, the muscle that rings the eye, that's sort of part of the genuine smile, versus the zygomaticus major, our cheek razor, which is present in both smiles. You can ignore the fine print for now. That's not so important. But that's where we did our recording from. And so what I'm going to show you are some EEG traces suggesting that the reward value of those smiles is anticipated when they're high reward smiles. So there's been a lot of processing on these data. I'm going to show you the traces. Now, if mimicry is taking place, if smile mimicry is taking place, what you're going to see, just to orient you, this is the time of onset for the expression. The 0 line in the middle. And this is a second after the smile has onset. And what we can see, the pattern you can see here, is that there are, for both genuine and polite smiles, people are showing activity above baseline for zygomaticus major, which is present in both smiles, and for orbicularis oculi, that's present for genuine smiles but not polite smiles, exactly what you would expect. So now let's ask when that motion starts. And it turns out that the orbicularis oculi motion starts long before, when you know what smile you're getting because you've learned the task. It starts long before you see the smile. So you're sitting there watching that neutral face with the green frame around it, and you're already starting to turn on your smiling muscles long before you see the smile. In fact, 2000, this becomes significant about 1,000 milliseconds out from prior to seeing the smile, which is pretty interesting. That people are actually predicting these smiles and engaging these muscles in advance of when those smiles onset. And there seems to be a difference between genuine and polite smiles based on their reward value. So that suggests that the value of these cues is actually shaping the way people respond to them in face-to-face interaction. Now, there probably is a lot of other stuff going on in interaction, but it gives us a little bit of traction for thinking about how to study these cues and how to start to make sense of all of these social signals. So now what we want to do is we want to ask another question. And that is the question, okay, so if we think that changing the value of a smile is going to affect how people use that smile, first of all, can we change the value of a smile? And secondly, what does it do in the context of an interaction? So in the social world, what do? So it turns out that if you look at rewards in general, there's an interesting finding that's true almost across, it's almost universally true across rewards that come to you, which is that when you are in a state of deprivation, you are willing to pay more. A reward is more rewarding when you desire it, right? A cookie right about now, it's kind of getting going at the quarter to supper time, is really rewarding, right? This is why payday loan companies are still in business, right? Because there are people who are willing to pay a lot of money to have some money now because they don't have very much. They're in a state of deprivation. So if we translate that to the social world, what's a sort of social analog to that? So we thought about this, and the thing we came up with is social rejection. So we've all had an experience of rejection or two in our lives. It happens to every single person, where, you get rejected by some of your peers. And hopefully it's a temporary thing. Hopefully it's a thing that happens and then you get over it and you go on and you're reintegrated into the group. And there's a lot of theory about what social rejection, and I'm not going to get into what social rejection does. What I want to do is just use the idea of the pain of social rejection and ask, well, the literature suggests to us that social stimuli and signals of belonging, like genuine smiles, should be more valuable to you if you are under a state of social rejection, if you feel like you've been rejected by your peers. So does this change the value of a smile? So how do we do that? Well, we have to lie to people to do this one, I'm sorry to say. So what we do in this task is we bring two participants into the lab, and they come in pairs to sort of, at least in experiment one here, they come in pairs to give them the illusion that they're going to be talking to one another later. And then we put them through, we have a very fancy computer program that we've programmed that allows them to fill out some personality questionnaires, and we use this as a sort of vehicle to give them some false feedback. And so based on the questions that they answer and the interactions they have with the other person, which is really a computer, we have developed 3 feedback types that we give people. And the first one is acceptance feedback, right? So this belongingness idea. So your partner's looking forward, they get a screen that eventually that tells them, oh, your partner's looking forward to meeting you and thinks you'll have a lot in common. Well, that feels kind of nice, doesn't it? Aren't things? But we tell other people, actually, your partner doesn't think they're gonna like you very much. Nobody cried, I promise. So the partner's not looking forward to meeting you. And now if you're going into that state, people find this feedback unpleasant, as you can imagine. And so we also have a third condition, and we call it our negative control condition. And what we do there is we tell people, actually, it's the sort of, it's not you, it's me feedback, where we say, oh, they're just not feeling very nice today. They're not feeling sociable. They don't really want to meet anybody. It's not you, it's them. So we give them that feedback too. And we've designed this computer program so that this feedback is very realistic. So then what we do is we take these participants and we give them our smile task. We've tweaked it though. So we've separated the win probability. So our high value faces are exactly the same as what they were before. Our low value faces this time are 60% instead of 70% faces, mostly because we want to make this difference just a little bit more dramatic. Okay, fine, fair enough. The other thing we've done is we've added 2 more faces here, faces that remain neutral for the entire task. And so what you get if you win is you get a little box, a text box pops up over the face and it says +2 pence or +0 pence, because you win 0 if you don't win. And so we have these neutral faces. And then they go through all of the possible pairings and they make their choices. And what we want to ask is what happens to the value of these smiles? That's their value of money. It's not important. So here's the value. Here's genuine smiles. So it turns out that they're worth between a penny and a penny and a half to see a genuine smile relative to a neutral face, which means participants are willing to give up the chance to, or they're willing to give up about a penny to a penny and a half for the chance to see a genuine smile relative to a neutral face. So they're going to pick a low value genuine smiler relative to a high value neutral face. Does that make sense? Okay, fine, no differences here. Now here's our polite smiles, and here's where we see it. No differences between acceptance and negative control. This is not a statistically significant difference. Both of these are positive. So they find polite smiles, positive stimuli, worth giving up a little bit of money for, but not quite as much as the genuine smiles. It's the rejected participants, they do not like the polite smiles, and they would rather pick a low value neutral face than a high value polite smiler. And we would actually have to increase the value by over half a penny of the politely smiling faces to make them indifferent. So they find polite smiles aversive stimuli. So it's not that genuine smiles become more valuable, it's that polite smiles become less valuable. So literature suggests that they move further apart. This is why we need a neutral condition. Okay, so this gives us a hypothesis now. If smile reciprocity, if this matters for smile reciprocity, what should we see? Well, after that rejection manipulation, what we should see is if you're responding to your partner based on how rewarding you think their cues are, we should see reduced reciprocity for polite smiles after that rejection manipulation. Make sense? So now we're going to bring this into the dyad. So we manipulate dyads slightly differently than we manipulate individual participants. We manipulate at the dyad level. And the dyad, of course, has 2 people in it. It has a target participant, and one of the people is randomly assigned by a computer in a double-blind fashion to be the target. And that person is randomly assigned to receive one of these 3 active feedback conditions. Same ones as before. They get exactly, the front end of this protocol looks exactly the same for the manipulated person. And they're paired with a neutral participant, somebody who gets absolutely no feedback about whether somebody's looking forward to meeting them or not. And that neutral person is nice because they're sort of a mirror, right? If we see changes in the target participant, are they apparent in the neutral participant's ratings and behavior, right? So this is one of the reasons we use neutral participants in these interactions. Otherwise it would get messy. We would need a lot of groups. This is slightly less messy, basically.
Why didn't you include a positive control group?
The acceptance is pretty positive. So people feel low on rejection and high on
But
positive.
instead of saying, this person thinks you have a lot in common, they're looking, if somebody, instead of, so,
Oh, this
because the
person's really
negative,
sociable today.
yeah, they've had a good day, they're looking.
Yeah. They're looking forward to
Yep.
meeting anyone.
Yep.
We didn't. So when we started this work, we didn't think that would be important. This is actually an interesting question, and we've got a little bit of data that's tentative at the moment, actually, from a social media study where we actually did a smile evaluation task before and after participants. So we asked participants to do a social media post on Facebook or
On MySpace?
their favorite social media platform, the one they post to most often. So we asked them to do that, and then 24 hours later, we brought them into the lab and asked them to do our smile evaluation task either before we asked them to tell us about their post or after. And they were randomly assigned to that condition. And that turns out it appears to increase the value of genuine smiles. So we don't know exactly. So that's a work in progress. It's a good question. We were kind of thinking about deprivation at that stage and hadn't thought about the other side of it. But there's some really interesting work that we've done that's related to that, actually. So anyway, what we want to know is what does smile reciprocity look like? So here's reciprocity for genuine smiles. This is our neutral people who are just our participants with no feedback. They don't look any different from anybody else on genuine smiles, and everybody looks not significantly different to anybody else. Here's the polite smiles, and we see exactly what we predicted, which is this drop in reciprocity for rejected participants. And in fact, they reduced the frequency, the proportion of their partner's smiles, their partner's polite smiles that they returned by about 20%. It's pretty dramatic. And in fact, that has implications for how much their partners like them. It turns out that when you don't reciprocate your partner's polite smiles, they don't like you very much. So the more these rejected participants return, the more their partners said, oh, I quite like my partner, which is really interesting. So it looks like reciprocity might actually be like we have a signal here, that reciprocity might actually relate to how people value these cues. And we're actually in the process of exploring whether it might be that when we give people this rejection manipulation, if they simply don't see these cues, if it takes longer to process polite smiles, we're asking a bunch of questions right now about what exactly is driving this effect. But that seems to be the pattern that we see. So now what we want to do is we want to bring this into the clinical world, which is the world where you guys all work in. And we want to ask, well, clinical disorders, almost everything in the DSM comes with social costs, right? Social interactions are problematic pretty much across the board in the DSM, at least at some stage of pretty much anything you can think of in that book. Certainly anything I can think of in that book. So the group that I work most with is schizophrenia. So you will all know the cardinal symptoms of schizophrenia are this idea of hallucinations and delusions. These are all paintings by an artist named Lewis Wayne, who is a British guy who painted sort of anthropomorphized cats and dogs back in the olden days, and it's really hard to make posthumous diagnoses, but there are psychiatrists out there who will give you a very good argument for that what they saw, he's in and out of institutions over the course of his life. And in fact, there's a movie coming out with Benedict Cumberbatch playing him, which I'm looking forward to. So sort of that kind of tracks his history over life. He's a very interesting artist, but you can kind of, this illustrates some of the florid ideas of what you see in schizophrenia, this idea of paranoia with but the other thing that happens in schizophrenia is social withdrawal. And there are a bunch of reasons why that social withdrawal might happen. Certainly some of them are self-imposed, where people just don't find social interactions pleasurable anymore quite so much, and so they withdraw. They also, but that's also of course depends on the participant, the other person that you're interacting with, because sometimes people find interacting with people who have schizophrenia really disconcerting. Sort of the nature of the beast. I spent a lot of time with these folks in postdoc, as it was a schizophrenia, basically a schizophrenia treatment center that I worked at. And they're fantastic people. but they're a bit odd to interact with. And they're odd for a bunch of reasons. They don't necessarily give you the cues back that you're expecting, so they're hard to interact with. But it also seems like they don't seek out those cues. They don't do the same kinds of behaviors that other people do. So when you pass somebody in the hallway, if you pass a colleague in the hallway, you might smile and say, hey, how's it going? The patients will respond to you when you do that, but they don't necessarily do it. They don't necessarily initiate it. So we worked with a group of schizophrenia patients and had them do our smile evaluation task. And I will tell you, I took the graph out. Well, maybe I shouldn't have done that. We don't see differences between patients with schizophrenia who are stable on medication, by the way. All of them are chronic, have been diagnosed, they're at least the minimum time for diagnosis is at least 5 years. So this is a chronic group. They can distinguish genuine from polite smiles just as well as controls, because we tested that very, very carefully, because there are problems with facial expression recognition in schizophrenia, or thought to be. So it turns out they respond to our smile evaluation test. They treat money about the same. They don't treat genuine smiles in the same way. Polite smiles, no differences. So it turns out that the value of a genuine smile for one of our control participants is 1.64 cents, so a little over a penny and a half, in US currency, by the way, that's where this one was. And for patients, this value is about a little over 0.10 of a penny. A little over a tenth of a penny in terms of how much so they're pretty indifferent for genuine smiles. They're not using genuine smiles to make their decisions in this time. They're going on the money. And people with schizophrenia tell us they like money too. When I was working there, they would come into my office with the same patient come in every week and say, you got any studies for me to do this week? And this would, and it wasn't just the one, there were a whole bunch of them that would knock on my door and say, you got any studies for me to do this week? So, because they would get brokered money for these, right? So they're not using these social cues in the same way that we would expect, or the same way that controls are. So maybe it's that the reward value falls out the bottom of these interactions. And that's one of the possibilities for at least some of the social withdrawal that we see in schizophrenia. We're in the process of doing a follow-up study looking at face-to-face interactions and how smile exchange works in those contexts. But that's been tricky because there's flat affects associated with medicine, which has been problematic. So we're working on that problem. And the last thing, I'll show you one more slide with data on it, looking at autism spectrum. So I'm not working currently with people who have autism, but we do have lots of undergraduates and we always ask undergraduates to report on their autism spectrum traits. So we give them the autism spectrum quotient scale, Simon-Baron-Cohen scale, and it's not a diagnostic inventory by any stretch of the imagination. But what it might be is it's sort of an indicator, right? If you score really high, it might be a flag that something is going on. We know that people who score high aren't rated as positively when you interact with them. Their interaction partners don't like them as well. So it turns out that when I comb through my data, I have approximately a little over 500 people who have done the smile evaluation task and given us an AQ. So we can ask, okay, so if we do what is standard in the literature, where you take the AQ and you do a median split and you split people into high and low, we've also done this with correlations, we can actually look at how they value smiles. And this is an interesting question, right? Now, what should happen based on the sort of standard story associated with autism spectrum disorders is that these traits should not be so rewarding, right? People don't make eye contact because it's not rewarding to look in eyes. People don't look at faces in this disorder because it's not rewarding to look at faces. Or at least that's the story I've heard in paper after paper after paper. Here's the responses to money, genuine smiles, and polite smiles. There are no differences on this graph at all. The people who are high and the people who are low, and we have enough data that they're pretty high and pretty low. And even when we split into like low, medium, and high, there's still no difference between between the low and the high. What does this mean for people who really have a clinically diagnosed disorder in the autism spectrum? I don't know, but I'm not sure that, based on these data, I'm not sure that I feel comfortable like sort of subjecting people to a protocol.
This isn't a dyad of 2 people.
This is not a dyad. This is just our smile evaluation task. We are working on the dyad problem right now on quantifying smile exchange in face-to-face interactions, and hopefully that would be a more sensitive metric, but we don't see it here. Interesting, yeah.
I think you have to try it on people with diagnosed autism because all the questionnaires are problematic.
All the questionnaires are problematic. These are self-report questionnaires. And when we use these, what we actually, the data that we're looking for actually is how comfortable are you with the kind of social chit chat, right? Because college to university students actually respond, they score higher than average on autism spectrum traits. And the reason they do that is because they respond in the sort of, spectrums of some of these are all university students. So they respond, so they have they're able to attach their attention to something and like forget other things. So they really attach, so they score higher on those kinds of symptoms, which are more traits than symptoms, I would think. But they score higher on this ability to focus their attention on average than someone from the general population. So we're actually working on that problem now to look in the general population, but also to look at kind of smile exchanges in these much more organic face-to-face interactions. But you're right, it would be really interesting to try this on people who have been clinically diagnosed. If anyone wants to collaborate, please let's chat afterward. And I'm just gonna wrap it up there because everybody's ready to go home. It's now 5 minutes to supper time. So it looks like social rewards are less rewarding for people with schizophrenia. We don't see this in non-diagnosed levels of autism symptoms. So it suggests to us that this is a really interesting way to think about social interactions and how people process those data, because it allows us to understand something and to actually even manipulate these interactions in a way that doesn't break the cause and effect chain of what's going on inside of an interaction. And I will end by thanking funders, by thanking collaborators, and by thanking you for your attention.
You said something about whether it's innate or not, and that you didn't want to say anything more.
Yes, correct.
Would you like to say something more? If you were just talking off the top of your head, let's say.
If I were talking off the top of my head, so I have one kid, and I might have, there's all of these data suggesting that kids who go on to develop autism don't look at faces quite as much. That there is, this is attention to faces. There's this sort of, male brain hypothesis where, boy babies don't look at faces quite as much as girls. People talk about some of that attention being innate. Now that I've had a kid, I don't know how many people in this room that state applies, except for one person whose kid is in the same class as mine. So they don't know anything when they're nothing. The visual system hasn't even had any, its first inputs is not, so it takes a while for the visual system to wire up. And what I suspect is if you look at sort of, the psychophysics of visual development, right, and these are really, really boring studies where people present Gabor patches with sort of more high versus low, low frequency information in them. And I suspect that what babies are responding to is edges, right? Edges have really clear, high definition boundaries. And faces have some really interesting edges in them. We have this mouth that moves, that creates, and it moves in a contingent way with the things that come out of it. But there's a lot of high frequency information between the the line that your lips make when they're closed and when they're open, what you do with it. Eyes are another thing, right? We have these eyes that have high contrast areas. We have white eyes with colored irises, and some of us have very light eyes, some of us have very dark eyes. It doesn't matter what your skin color is, because if your skin color is darker, there's still huge high contrast information there. So I suspect that probably what infants are responding to is contrast, at least at the beginning. That would be my guess based on the psychophysics and what we know about about the development of the visual system. So I suspect this is probably learned, right? There's this magical little time that happens when you're like sort of about 6 weeks in with your first kid. It's magical with your first kid. I don't know about second kids because I don't have one of those. But
Not so magical.
not so magical, yeah. So that's what I would imagine. But you know, but there's this contingent smiling that starts, and these interactions between caregivers, mothers and fathers, and their babies, where the baby smiles to catch the parents and the parent smiles back, and all of a sudden it adds another dimension to how I interact with the world if I'm an infant, right? First, I interact with the world by crying, right? When I am uncomfortable, I cry and somebody does something about it, right? Now I have another way to interact with the world, and I can use my face. And what babies learn with those very early interactions is this contingency that happens between mothers and children. I suspect, if I'm totally talking off the cuff and sort of off the record, though I know this is on the record, I suspect that this sort of much ado is made about the attachment relationship, and I suspect that one of the signals, we have some evidence from some other work that we've done that's totally unrelated to this, is the reliability of the environment matters a lot to how you interpret things in that environment. And so I suspect that the reliability with which those signals occur from caregivers to infants probably matters more than anything else there. Does that mean that, you know, the brains of people who go on to get diagnosed start out at the same place? I don't know. I couldn't possibly comment on that. But I suspect that this is learned.
Because the psychologist, I can't think of her name now, she speaks in her hypothesis that children who later go on to develop autism, they aren't as innately interested in faces. And so they don't look at faces as much, and so they don't get that input, so their brain doesn't develop. But just based on what you're saying,
it might be a visual thing, right? And we don't know.
And it might not be necessarily smiles, it's just maybe the way a face looks or something with the edges. But even I think what probably keeps parents talking to their kids more is the smiling and the reciprocal stuff.
Yes,
and so
absolutely.
I was thinking, with what you're talking about with people with schizophrenia, if you had that dyadic thing, and you know how much their partners rate the interaction.
Well, this is actually a project that we currently have going on. We are currently collecting data on that project right now, looking at people who, at our patients, interacting with people who don't know them. So we've got a research assistant on this, a couple of them actually, there's a little bevy of them, interacting on this project, looking at exactly that. So these are people who, they have never met the patients, and they don't know which of the people they, at least not going into the interaction, because it doesn't take long to figure this out, they don't know if they're interacting with controls or people who have schizophrenia, because we are very careful to keep them naive, at least up until that interaction starts. Now again, do they figure it out by the end of the interaction? Yes, they do, but they don't start out that way. So we're actually looking at that process. And there's another group of people who are really interesting, who have been called, you know, like these sort of super altruistic people. So these are people who have donated a kidney to a complete stranger who they will never meet, have never met, and they've done it because they have the right blood type, so they might as well. I mean, they've got two after all. Kidney donation is from a living donor, is a pretty significant and difficult operation, and it, you know, the potential for death is there, right? So these are people who are, you know, happy to sign up for a full, at least a week of pain, plus like the, you know, you take about a month off of work if you do this, right? So these are amazing altruists, and we're actually looking at this reciprocity for them too. And they interact in it. They feel different. They feel extremely engaged when you interact with them. And I suspect that that engagement signal so what I feel when I talk to these people is actually better and faster reciprocity would be my guess. So we're actually in the process of looking at that across a couple of different populations.
Because if you look at the opposite of that, then people with autism, then maybe they don't find those smiles as rewarding, and so they don't engage as much over time.
Yeah, or there might be something else going on there,
Yeah.
right? It's possible that there's a visual deficit as well, right? Where they can't tell the difference between them as well, which we don't have data on at the moment. So there are some interesting questions. Yeah.
Just something to think about. It also brings up the question about how visually impaired children develop social skills.
Yeah, and there are probably other ways that they do that. It's probably less facial, I would imagine, and
Yes.
more in the oral domain.
Yeah.
Because there are some really interesting studies of, I guess, babbling. Which kind of seems to serve some of those same purposes for those folks. So this, and the same thing is true with there are other disorders as well. So people who have hearing impairments but not vision impairments, right? And they babble in sign language, right? And the babbling, those reciprocal communications will be very similar. So yeah, I think there's a lot of developmental processes going on. It's nothing that we can experiment on. All we can do, and one of the things I think the field needs to do, is collect a lot more data so that we can actually look, because of the sparsity of social data, because no two interactions are the same. We actually really need to collect a lot more data so that we can map that landscape and see what it really looks like.
Jennifer, do generally blind kids who are otherwise typically developing, and I don't know how many of those there are, but do they smile when they meet people?
They can. We've seen kids like that who are visually impaired, they've picked up on oral cues and they become very social.
Yeah.
And they don't see your face at all, and they don't see a smile. They can pick up the person coming towards them, they can hear, feel them without you talking.
But wouldn't
And they
that
just
suggest
smile.
it's innate in most cases if they can't see it?
Not necessarily. You can hear emotion, no problem. Think about a phone call that doesn't have video with it. You know exactly
I
what the
guess
other
that's
person.
somebody's blind and deaf, I guess then, but then, I don't know how much of a social.
But I mean, if they
Yeah.
were completely blind, they would never see a smile.
No,
So
they
they would
don't.
have to.
Well,
So our
That's what I feel,
must be
people are
somehow
generally blind.
wired to generally.
And they've never seen it.
Yeah, I mean, if you never ever see one, right? We do. It is an expression we do. I don't.
No, I actually just have a question around rejection. So would it be correct, based on your work, to conclude that someone who gets a lot of rejection, like someone who's polite, would then respond less to polite smiles and would then be less liked? And therefore
Well, it's
rejected even more?
Well, it's a question, and in chronic cases, it's hard to know what happens. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training. So I've worked with kids who have this problem, and one of the things that I've noticed is you can take the kid out of the school, you can dress him in different clothes, you can give him the right glasses, you can change a lot of the things about the kid that, he claims are or she claims are the problem things. The rejection history follows oftentimes. So there must be something that the kid is taking with them that causes that. What it is, I don't know. It might be the anticipation of rejection, and so we know there's quite a lot of reciprocity in terms of if you know that I like you, you're more likely to like me, right? And in fact, if you kind of think about people with whom you've had those interactions, if you think about somebody meeting them, you're probably not going to like them. It feels different to interact with them than somebody that with the same person. If I said, oh, I think you'll really like this person, right? So there's a lot of reciprocity there. So if you're a kid who assumes that you're going to be rejected, you might be rejected for all kinds of reasons, and part of it is probably stuff that you do. In fact, most of it is probably stuff that you do. What it is, I think this is one piece of the puzzle, and these are not people who are chronically rejected. They're not selected on that. And in fact, the participants, one of the conditions of our ethics committee was that these participants not be particularly socially anxious. which is, this is here for people who have social anxiety. So we actually pre-screened all of these folks, and they were never invited to participate in any of these studies if they were high on social anxiety, if they reported symptoms of social anxiety. Again, self-report, not diagnosis. So, what people are doing, we don't know. We are only this is just the tip of the iceberg. It really is. There's so much here. These are rich signals. It takes years and years and years to learn how these processes work, right? If you take an interaction like teasing, for instance, like friendly teasing, like the kind you do with your colleagues over what cookies you'd like to eat or whether you like coffee crisp. So if you think about those kinds of interactions that you have, right?
I'm trying to call that friendly though.
Well, okay, so on a Friday night, go to the cinema and watch the adolescents, wherever they are, right? They trash talk and they say things that are really nasty to one another, but actually it's funny and it builds relationships and and it's all in good fun and everybody's friends afterward most of the time, right? So it's that kind of teasing.
No, I totally agree, but my patients, when they say that,
Yeah, mine is too.
Yeah.
they are like,
Oh, yeah.
police get called, they are thrown out, they are never allowed
But
back.
there's a
Yeah,
like,
like,
it's
the
like,
same words, because
Yes, no, that's exactly right. It depends on how you say it. And it takes kids will tell you that they are bullied up until they're about 12 years old. When you say, oh, well, how does teasing work? And tell me some examples of teasing. They don't discriminate between friendly and between those two different kinds of teasing. So it takes a really long time to learn this, and it also takes a really long time to be able to do it well, right? Because when we tease in that way, we give these markers that say this is totally off the record. And it's sort of and in fact, the recipient is expected to come right back up in your face and give you one back, right? And as long as, so groups use this. I did a study many, many years ago looking at fraternity boys. And they tease a lot. This is how the norms are established and dispensed in social fraternities anyway, and probably a lot of other groups. But they engage in these really interesting teasing relationships where high status guys tease low status guys about social norms, and the low status guys, and in fact the ones that end up rising in the ranks of the fraternities organization, those guys come right back at the big guys, right, and they're vicious sounding, right, but they're funny. So there's a chance everybody laughs it off, and probably no feelings were hurt. But what it allows you to do is it's a mechanism that probably allows groups to establish and maintain hierarchies while allowing members to say things, right? So part of this depends on what you do when you do this, right? How do you engage in those interactions, and how do you take them? So when we look at kids who have been diagnosed with autism, again, work that I did 1,000 years ago. I'm that old. But or we ask kids, well, how do you know when someone's teasing you? And they would say things like, I don't know until I feel it in here, right? Or I don't know until somebody tells me, actually, there's a social rule and here's what it is, and then I realize and then I feel bad, right? So it doesn't seem to be this, like they don't seem to read those signals in the same way. Why, I couldn't possibly tell you. It would take a long, I mean, that's a lifetime's worth of work in and of itself, right?
But it's an interesting question because kids just pick it up.
Kids pick it up. It takes a long time. Kids pick it up. And kids who have older siblings pick it up faster because they're older, yeah.
Because we also see the opposite. Sometimes we see lots of, some kids who don't understand when they're being teased, which raises a philosophical question. If you don't know you're being teased, are you actually being teased? But also kids who then think everybody's teasing them no matter what they say, and so they overemphasize it. And there's not silly stuff. But I think the question of social smiling on the autism diagnostic interview, one of the questions is, do they reciprocally smile socially when they meet people? And most of the people who would say, they could see their kids saying no. If somebody smiles at them, they don't smile back.
And in fact, this in some ways this leads us down the wrong track too, because then we have all these interventions, right, where we have people, you know, like looking at these kids, looking at these smiles, and we look at this, and now here's what we do, and we see people, and then they like put these sort of really,
Yeah, it's really artificial.
these artificial, like sort of grimacy looking faces on, and they look weird. Yes. It's the smile my kid makes for school pictures every day. So, which is this really grimacy looking, like, this a lovely smile, but boy, it never shows up on school pictures. So, so there are all, and then it becomes, you know, well, how do I interpret that as a recipient?
Have you heard of Michael Gladwell's new book?
What's the name of it?
Malcolm Gladwell?
Malcolm Gladwell,
Yep.
here's his new book.
Yes, I haven't heard it yet.
Sounds like Titans or something.
Well, basically, I haven't read it yet. I just like saw a couple interviews and speaking to various.
I think like saying we talk to a real psychologist about Malcolm Gladwell, they tend to think very negatively about it.
Exactly. So I was just gonna say that. The new theory that he's put forth now is that none of us can read each other at all.
Well, that's probably, I would actually probably agree with him about that. I suspect, I mean, you know, so if we, this is one of the reasons we've stepped back from the psychological approaches to social cues, because we don't know what they mean. And all it is a reverse inference problem where I go, oh, you smiled, that must mean you're happy.
But we do know what
really?
they mean, though, that's the thing.
We don't, in the moment.
Yes.
But the question is, so one of the projects that we're starting, or that I'm actually I'm in the middle of Grant Howland's on Tuesday, which is actually to look at how people accumulate evidence. And I suspect where we're going to see it is that there's sort of a more positive, like that you get a cue and it might make you feel a little bit more positive or a little bit more negative. And so there's sort of a little barometer for what happens, and that good outcomes happen when that goes up. We want those good outcomes. We want that positive feeling. And I suspect that the cues we see are not dissected in any sort of, you know, oh, well, you know, this person and this is my relationship to them, and I saw them do this, but then they also did that. And we don't do that now. Oh my goodness. It would never work.
He said that we do that math, but we ignore it because we want a positive outcome.
Well, yes, so I expect that we're accumulating positives and negatives, and we're not doing that interpretation. That very complicated interpretation is what I would suspect is probably going on, but I don't know, and we need to map this domain.
That's because I find talking to parents when I swear completely flat and give you nothing back. I find it really uncomfortable. If you don't get any, because even if they look angry, at least you have some emotional sense of what they're doing.
I told you about they both wear sunglasses the whole
Really?
And they were looked very rough too, and I didn't even want to ask what was going on. And then at the end, one of them told me that they had some seizures that were set off by fluorescent lights. So, well, just one, right? So, and then I said, oh, okay, I can turn off the fluorescent lights. I turn them off, and then she turned her sunglasses off. And then the other one, then she hers off too, but she didn't have the seizures either. So I don't know, sort of in solidarity or something. Anyway, you're right. It was very uncomfortable.
Well, it is very uncomfortable because then a little cue that most of the time would be noise, you know, and filtered out, because we don't see most of the cues people do because it's noise, right? I don't, you know, pay attention to your breathing, but I can see it. I don't pay attention to the color changes that happen on your face from moment to moment, but I can see them. And if you sort of take a stream of interaction, if you take a stream of interaction from this video, actually my face hasn't even been in this video very much, but if you were to take that and you were to clip at one place versus another place, my face would look totally different in color, and so much so that it actually throws off the white balance of this if I'm standing in front of a white wall. It's amazing. It's huge. It's a huge signal. We don't notice it, but people's faces change colors even when they're not blushing, and they change depending on the eggs. Really interesting, right? You can see we've got software now that can calculate your heart rate based on just standard, you know, mobile phone video with you. Wow. So we can get this kind of, we get a little bit of physiology without being invasive and intrusive and sticking sensors on people, which is, you know, so there are signals out there that we don't pay attention to that are noise, but if you're not getting anything, all of a sudden you get a little something that might be noise and that you might just completely flat out erase from somebody else, it becomes very salient because there's nothing else there, right? So then and that I think is one of the things that makes those interactions confusing. We look for predictability, we look for regularity, and regularity is comfortable. And when it's outside of those bounds, this is why talking to somebody from a different culture who has different social norms than you can be also really disconcerting in a totally different way, because you just don't know how to interpret these things. You don't know what they mean.
You're right. So, because I couldn't see their faces really, the sort of biker shirts that they had on was just very prominent to me.
Yeah.
But then once they took them off, then they look like
But you
red.
can also see that how like somebody with social anxiety who's not necessarily providing the same feedback. I wonder if that would make people less willing or less interested in interacting with them in the future. It's
Well,
not rewarding.
and it
It's not
might do
of
because it's
negative feedback.
uncomfortable. Exactly. So there are many reasons why this can happen. Many reasons.
So it's wonderful talking to you.
Anyway, thanks very much for inviting me.
So see you Friday morning.